I always liked driving at night. There was something peaceful about it. The empty roads, the hum of the engine, the way the world felt quieter. It was like being in my own little bubble, away from everything. That's probably why I took the back roads so often, even when I didn't need to. It felt better than sitting in traffic or dealing with the rush of the highway. But that night, I wished I had stuck to the main roads. It was late September, and I was heading back home from a work trip. I had been on the road for hours, cutting through the middle of nowhere, somewhere between small towns that barely showed up on the map. It was the kind of place where gas stations were rare, and if you broke down, you were out of luck unless you had someone to call. I didn't think much about it at the time. I had a full tank, my car was running fine, and I just wanted to get home. The night was cold, and the sky was dark. No moon, no stars, just thick clouds overhead. My headlights were the only thing lighting up the narrow road ahead. On either side, there was nothing but empty fields and stretches of trees, the kind that seemed endless. Every now and then, I'd pass an old barn or a rundown house set far back from the road, barely visible in the dark. But for the most part, it was just me and the road. I must have been driving for over an hour without seeing another car when I noticed something ahead. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing on the side of the road, just past a curve, right on the edge where the grass met the asphalt. I slowed down a little, not sure what to do. It was strange seeing someone out here in the middle of the night, miles away from anything. He wasn't near a house or a car, just standing there like he had been waiting for something. I kept my headlights on him as I got closer, and that's when I got a better look. He was wearing dark clothes, a jacket that looked worn out, and pants that were too loose. His hair was messy, and even from a distance, something about him seemed off. He wasn't waving me down, wasn't trying to get my attention. He was just standing still, facing the road, like he was expecting me to stop. I didn't. Something about it didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way he stood there, too still, too quiet. Or maybe it was just the fact that he was out here in the first place, in the middle of nowhere, with no car, no flashlight, nothing. I eased my foot back onto the gas and kept going, watching him in my rearview mirror as I passed. He didn't move, didn't turn his head, just kept standing there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy who had maybe broken down somewhere and was waiting for help. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about him felt wrong. I kept driving, trying to put it out of my mind. But then, maybe 20 minutes later, I saw him again. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. There was no way. I had been driving straight, no turns, no side roads that I had noticed. But there he was, standing on the side of the road again, just like before. Same clothes, same posture, same eerie stillness. My hands tightened on the wheel. I felt my stomach drop. It didn't make sense. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't seen another car, no headlights, nothing. The only way he could have beaten me there was if he had cut straight through the fields or the woods. But even then, he wouldn't have made it in time. I didn't slow down this time. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest. As I passed him, I stole a quick glance. He was still watching. I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a different person. Maybe I was just tired and seeing things. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. It was the same man. I drove faster, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. But the road stretched on and on. No towns, no gas stations, just emptiness. And then I saw him again. I nearly slammed on the brakes. He was farther ahead this time, but still there, standing just at the edge of the road. I didn't understand. It wasn't possible. He couldn't have gotten ahead of me. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel my hands shaking. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to look, but my eyes locked on him as I passed. This time he moved. It was just a small movement, his head turning slightly to follow me as I went by. But it was enough. Enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't look back. I kept driving, foot pressed hard on the gas. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I needed to get out of there. I needed to reach civilization, a gas station, anything. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The road stretched on, endless, dark. And then, in the distance, I saw lights. A town. Relief flooded through me. I had never been so happy to see streetlights in my life. I didn't care how small the town was, as long as there were people. As I reached the first intersection, I pulled into a gas station, the first one I had seen in hours. I parked near the pumps, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. The station was mostly empty, just a single car parked near the convenience store. I sat there for a minute trying to calm myself down. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't know how it was possible, but I wasn't going to question it anymore. I just wanted to get home. After a few deep breaths, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the store. I needed a drink, something to steady my nerves, and then I froze. Through the glass doors inside the station, standing near the back, was the man. He wasn't looking at me this time. He was just standing there, near the shelves, staring at nothing. I turned around, got back in my car, and drove. I didn't stop again. Not until I reached home, hours later. My mind still racing with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. I don't know how he got there. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing. I never take back roads at night anymore. I never should have been out there alone. Looking back, I can see every single mistake I made. I had no backup plan. No one knew exactly where I was. I didn't pack right for the weather. But the biggest mistake was thinking I knew those mountains better than I did. It was late October, and I had taken a week off work to get away from everything. Life had been a mess. Stress piling up from every angle, and I just needed to be somewhere no one could reach me. I'd spent years hunting, hiking, and camping in remote places, so this wasn't new to me. I had done trips like this plenty of times before. I drove out to a stretch of land deep in Colorado, miles away from anything resembling civilization. It was rugged country, twisting dirt roads, thick pines, cold streams cutting through valleys. No phone service, no towns, just wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the base of an old logging road and hiked 5 miles up into the mountains until I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was a small patch of flat land nestled between thick trees with a sharp ridge running along the east side. I had camped there years before and remembered it being a good spot. Secluded, plenty of game in the area, and safe from flash floods or rock slides. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything settled before dark. The air was cold, but the sky was clear. Perfect weather for camping. I made a small fire, ate a quick meal, and sat under the stars, breathing in the crisp mountain air. No cars, no voices, nothing but the wind moving through the trees. The first night was quiet. I slept fine, woke up early, and spent the day hiking around, scouting for good hunting spots. I found some tracks, deer, maybe an elk or two, but nothing too exciting. I was mainly there to get away, so I wasn't in a rush to shoot anything. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, the woods started to feel different. I can't explain it, but something was just off. The way the wind moved, the way the trees felt like they were closing in a little more. I chalked it up to being alone in deep wilderness. Your mind plays tricks on you when there's nothing but silence and shadows around. I started noticing small things that felt wrong. Twigs snapping in strange patterns, as if something was moving in a way that didn't make sense. I'd hear something in one direction, And then a moment later, another sound from the opposite side of camp. Could have been animals, probably was, but I've spent enough time in the woods to know the usual noises. This didn't sound right. I stayed close to the fire that night, feeling more on edge than I wanted to admit. The silence wasn't natural. There was no movement in the trees, no distant rustling, no night calls from owls or coyotes, just dead, heavy stillness. Then came the smell, rotten, sickly, like spoiled meat left out in the sun too long. It hit me suddenly, thick in the cold air, and I gagged. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal. It was worse, more pungent, more unnatural. My stomach turned, and I grabbed my rifle. My first thought was a carcass nearby, maybe a mountain lion's kill. But I didn't hear anything dragging it. No flies, no signs of fresh blood. Just that horrible, suffocating stench hanging in the air. I backed up toward the fire, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I stayed awake most of the night, rifle in my lap, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting just beyond my line of sight. My skin crawled, but I forced myself to stay calm. The fire burned low, and as the first light of morning broke over the ridge, the smell faded. The woods felt normal again. The birds started calling. The wind felt like it was moving right. I convinced myself it was just nerves. Maybe a dead animal somewhere close by, maybe a predator passing through. But I knew better. That day, I packed up and moved camp a few miles west. It wasn't far, but it put some distance between me and whatever had made me feel that way. The new spot was on higher ground, with a clearer view of the valley below. I figured if something was lurking around, I'd see it coming. By late afternoon, I had my new camp set up. Everything felt normal again. The unease from the night before started to fade, and I let myself relax. That was my second mistake. That night, the smell came back. Stronger, closer. I barely had time to process it before the noises started. Low, unnatural sounds just beyond the fire's reach. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something trying to sound like an animal but failing. The pitch was wrong, the movement too deliberate. My blood turned to ice. Then, footsteps. Not a deer, not a bear. Human footsteps, but wrong. Too light, too fast, circling the edges of the fire. I gripped my rifle so tight my knuckles ached. Then I saw it, just beyond the trees, barely visible in the flickering firelight. A shape, a figure standing still, watching. It looked human, almost, but its limbs were too long. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, the way a predator sizes up its prey. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It took a step forward, and the firelight caught its face. No, not a face. Not really. It was stretched, distorted, like it was wearing someone else's skin that didn't fit right. The eyes were wrong, dead, hollow, like they were trying to remember how to look human. I don't remember deciding to run. 1 second, I was frozen, staring at that thing, and the next, I was sprinting toward my truck. I left everything behind, my tent, my gear, my pack. I didn't care. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the trees, not daring to look back. I could hear it moving behind me, fast, too fast. The smell was overwhelming, burning my throat, making my stomach turn. Then silence. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I burst through the trees, reached my truck, and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I jumped in, slammed the lock down, and started the engine. The headlights lit up the tree line. Nothing, just empty woods. But I knew it was still there, watching. I didn't waste time. I tore down that dirt road, not caring if I wrecked the truck. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, didn't pull over until I was miles and miles away. I never went back, never even thought about trying to get my gear. That thing, whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. I don't go deep into the mountains alone anymore. I don't camp where no one can find me, because some things out there don't want to be found. And if you get too close, they let you know. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The rain had been coming down for hours, the kind that turned dirt roads into thick mud and made visibility nearly impossible. My truck's headlights barely cut through the downpour, and the wipers did little against the sheets of water hammering the windshield. The clock on the dashboard read 11:43 p.m. I had been driving for close to 7 hours, taking back roads through farmland, forests, and stretches of empty plains. I liked driving at night, especially in places where there were no other cars, no streetlights, just me and the road. But I wasn't stupid. When the fuel gauge dipped below a quarter tank, I knew I had to stop soon. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Somewhere in the Midwest, miles from the last real town. The gas station I found was the kind you only see in places like this. Just a single pump under a rusted metal awning, an old convenience store with a flickering neon open sign, and nothing else around but dark fields stretching out on both sides of the road. I pulled in, shutting off the engine and listening to the sound of rain drumming against the roof. The store's lights buzzed inside. I didn't see anyone through the front window. There were no other cars at the pump. I hesitated before stepping out, glancing at the dark road behind me. The last vehicle I had passed was almost an hour ago. I wasn't expecting company, but something about the quiet made me uneasy. I left the truck running as I got out, hood pulled over my head, and sprinted toward the store to escape the rain. The bell over the door jingled when I stepped inside. The place smelled like damp wood and something old, like the air had been sitting there for decades. Shelves were stocked with expired snack foods, dusty cans of soup, and faded road maps. A small fridge hummed against the wall, filled with lukewarm bottles of soda and beer. The counter was empty. A small sign read, "Ring bell for service." I pressed the little metal button. A moment passed. No answer. I tapped the bell again, the chime ringing out in the silence. Still nothing. I glanced back at my truck through the rain-streaked window. The pump was old, one of the kinds that didn't take cards. I needed to pay inside. I looked toward a door behind the counter, slightly open, leading to what I assumed was a back room. "Hello," I called, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No answer. I turned back to the shelves, grabbing a bottle of water and a pack of peanuts, pretending like everything was normal. Maybe the clerk was in the bathroom. Maybe they didn't hear me. I waited another minute, then placed a $10 bill on the counter, hoping they'd find it later. I left the store, hurrying back to my truck. I didn't see the man standing near the pump until I was almost at my door. I stopped, gripping the handle. He wasn't there a second ago. He stood a few feet from my truck, dressed in dark clothes, rain dripping from the brim of his baseball cap. His face was shadowed, features obscured by the dim lighting of the gas station's overhang. He wasn't moving. I swallowed hard. "Didn't see you there," I said automatically, voice tight. He didn't answer. I glanced toward the store. No sign of anyone inside. The feeling in my gut turned to ice. "I was just leaving," I muttered, pulling the door open. The man shifted, stepping toward me. I tensed. He was closer now, close enough that I could see his face. Water dripped from his nose. His expression was blank, his lips slightly parted, like he had been standing in the rain for hours. I got in, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hand fumbled for the gear shift. The man took another step, stopping just beside my truck's window. His eyes never left mine. I pressed down on the gas pedal, tires spinning in the mud before catching traction. The truck jerked forward, nearly fishtailing as I sped away. My heart was pounding against my ribs. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, unmoving, watching me drive off into the night. The road stretched endlessly ahead. The storm had gotten worse. Wind pushed against the truck, forcing me to keep both hands tight on the wheel. I kept checking the mirror, convinced I'd see headlights behind me, but the road was empty. I exhaled, forcing myself to calm down. Just some guy, I told myself. Maybe he was stranded, waiting for help. Maybe he was just some local checking on the store. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, barely visible through the rain, a pair of lights appeared in the distance. I stared at them. My truck was the only vehicle at that gas station. That meant someone had been parked somewhere nearby. Maybe in the field, maybe off the road, just waiting. I pressed the gas, speeding up. The headlights behind me did the same. The chase lasted for miles. I kept expecting them to back off, to turn off onto another road, but they stayed right behind me, their high beams cutting through the rain, getting closer, too close. Then the road curved, and I saw the bridge. A wooden bridge, barely wide enough for 2 cars. The rain had turned the river below into a raging current. My tires skidded on the wet wood as I made the turn. Then I saw the shape in the road. A figure, standing in the middle of the bridge. The same man. I barely had time to react. I swerved, tires catching the slick surface, the truck spinning out of control. My head slammed against the window as the world turned sideways. The truck hit the guardrail, metal screeching as I tore through it, and then I was falling. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. Water surged into the truck, ice cold and fast. I fumbled for the seatbelt, fingers slipping. My vision swam, the cab filled with water. I managed to unbuckle myself, lungs burning as I pushed toward the door. It wouldn't open. The truck was sinking. I slammed my shoulder against the window, cracked but didn't break. Darkness swirled around me. My body screamed for air. Then, a hand reached through the broken windshield. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed it. I was yanked through, gasping as I surfaced. Rain pelted my face. The current was strong, dragging me downstream. I looked up. The man from the gas station stood on the bridge, watching. Not the one who pulled me out. That was someone else. I turned, coughing, struggling to swim toward the riverbank. The headlights from the vehicle on the bridge shone down, but I couldn't see inside. Whoever had been chasing me never came down. I collapsed on the shore, soaked, shaking, lungs burning. When I looked up again, the truck was gone, swallowed by the river. The bridge was empty, no headlights, no man. I was alone. I don't know who saved me. I never saw them again. I had been deep in research for almost a decade, studying insects for medical purposes. Some of the most groundbreaking discoveries in medicine had come from the study of nature: antibiotics from fungi, painkillers from plants, and even surgical glue from spider silk. I specialized in entomology, focusing on rare insects and their potential to help in medical advancements. That's what brought me to the middle of nowhere in 2016, somewhere in the heart of Australia's vast outback. A research grant from my university had given me the opportunity to investigate a species of beetle with a unique secretion that showed promise as an antimicrobial agent. This particular beetle had only been documented a handful of times, and reports suggested it thrived in a remote, arid region that was difficult to access. There were no real roads, only rough dirt paths used by off-road vehicles and occasional bushwalkers. It was one of those places where you wouldn't see another human for days, maybe weeks. I flew into Alice Springs, rented a four-wheel drive truck, and stocked it with all the essentials: food, water, fuel, camping gear, and my field equipment. The drive took me nearly 10 hours through nothing but barren land. Red dust coated everything, and the heat was relentless. When I finally reached my designated research area, I set up camp near a dried-up riverbed. It was far from civilization, just the way I needed it to be. During the first few days, my work went smoothly. I scoured the landscape, overturned rocks, dug into loose soil, and set up pitfall traps. The beetle was elusive, but I managed to catch a few specimens that fit its description. I examined them carefully, recording data and collecting samples. Everything was going according to plan. Then, on the fourth night, things started to feel off. The outback was supposed to be silent at night. At least that's what I had been told. But something was moving out there. It wasn't the usual rustling of small creatures or the distant calls of nocturnal birds. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone or something was carefully stepping through the dry brush. I told myself it was probably just a dingo or a kangaroo, but the unease stayed with me. The next morning, I noticed something odd. A few of my pitfall traps had been disturbed, not just tipped over but completely crushed. That wasn't normal. Even if an animal had stumbled into them, they wouldn't have been smashed like that. I checked the area for tracks, but the dry, cracked ground didn't show much. Whatever had done this had been careful. I reset the traps, reinforced them with small rocks, and continued my work. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were closer. I was in my tent, going over my notes, when I heard the distinct crunch of dry twigs outside. It was deliberate, not the random scuttling of an insect or the wind shifting debris. I turned off my headlamp and sat completely still, listening. Nothing. The silence stretched on for minutes. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard it again. Slow, measured steps. Closer. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated before turning it on. Instead, I peered out through the small mesh window of my tent. It was dark, but my eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes in the dim moonlight. That's when I saw it. Something was crouching near my equipment, just at the edge of my campsite. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what I was looking at. It was low to the ground, unmoving, but I could see that it wasn't an animal, not in any way I recognized. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then slowly it shifted. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, rising slightly before lowering itself again. I still couldn't make out details, but the way it moved made my stomach tighten. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the darkness. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching my knife and flashlight, my mind racing with explanations. Had it been a trick of the light? A shadow playing tricks on me? Maybe my exhaustion was making me paranoid. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I found something that stopped me cold. The traps were destroyed again. Not just overturned, but completely ripped apart. The metal frames were bent and twisted, something no dingo or goanna could have done. And then there were the tracks. They weren't human. They weren't animal either. The prints were elongated, almost like an insect's, but far too large. The indentations in the dirt were deep, suggesting something heavy had made them. They led away from my camp, disappearing into the dry brush. I considered packing up and leaving right then and there, but I had come too far to give up. My logical mind kept pushing back against the fear. There had to be a rational explanation. I spent the day working, but my nerves were shot. Every sound made me flinch. The usual hum of insects, the occasional rustling of leaves. It all felt amplified, like the entire landscape was watching me. As night fell, I made a decision. I would keep watch, If something or someone was messing with my work, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I killed all my lights and waited. Hours passed. The desert cooled, and the wind picked up, sending dry leaves skittering across the ground. I stayed alert, every muscle tensed. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The same deliberate steps, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. Then something scraped against my truck. I nearly dropped the light. My truck was parked only a few feet away, meaning whatever was out there was right next to my tent. I slowly unzipped the flap, just enough to peek outside. And that's when I saw it. A shape hunched over, its movements insect-like but disturbingly human in size. It had too many joints, its limbs bending in ways that didn't make sense. It moved with a slow, unsettling grace, its head tilting as it examined my truck. I could see its surface glistening under the faint moonlight. Not fur, not skin, something else. Something hard, like the exoskeleton of an insect. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my knife, my mind screaming for me to do something. Anything. Then, as if sensing me, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then it bolted. It moved faster than anything I had ever seen, disappearing into the darkness with unnatural speed. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed what I could, stuffed my most important research notes into my bag, and threw everything into my truck. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, kicking up dust as I sped away. I didn't stop driving until I reached Alice Springs. I never went back. I sent what samples I had to the university, but I refused to continue the project. The official report I filed mentioned unidentified environmental disturbances and unusual wildlife interference. I never elaborated. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that some things should stay undiscovered. It was late September when I found myself driving through the back roads of northern Montana, heading home from a long-haul job. The route I had taken was unfamiliar, but I was confident it would cut down my travel time by a few hours. The rain had started earlier that afternoon, a steady drizzle at first, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, it turned into a relentless downpour. My wipers struggled to keep up, and the dark, twisting road ahead became harder to see with every mile. I had been driving for hours, and the last town I passed was nearly an hour back. My fuel gauge hovered just above empty, and my eyes burned from the strain of staring at the road. The only thing that kept me going was the promise of reaching a main highway soon, where I could stop for gas, stretch my legs, and maybe grab a coffee to keep me awake. The rain made the road slick, and I eased off the accelerator as I came around a bend. That's when I saw it. A dark shape in the middle of the road. My headlights barely caught it in time. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding on the wet pavement before coming to a stop just inches from the figure. It was a man. He stood motionless, completely drenched, his clothes hanging off him like dead weight. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see enough to tell he wasn't right. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there like he had been waiting for me. My first instinct was to lock my doors. I sat there for a moment waiting for him to move, but he didn't. The rain pounded against my windshield, and I could hear it drumming on the roof of my truck. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts as I tried to figure out what to do. There was no way around him. The road was narrow with thick trees on either side. I thought about reversing, but my tires were already slipping, and I wasn't sure I could manage it in this rain without ending up in a ditch. Then he moved. Slowly, he stepped toward my truck, his head tilting slightly as if he was trying to get a better look at me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Something about him wasn't right. He wasn't waving for help, wasn't shouting, wasn't acting like someone in distress. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no service. The man stopped just a few feet from my hood. He stood there, staring at me through the rain. The longer I looked at him, the more wrong he seemed. His clothes weren't just wet. They looked torn, almost shredded. His skin, what little I could see of it in the dim light, was covered in dirt, like he had been crawling through the mud. Then, in an instant, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't wait around. The second he was out of the way, I hit the gas, my tires spinning for a second before finding traction. My heart pounded in my chest as I sped down the road, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure he wasn't behind me. The rain didn't let up, and the road only got worse. Potholes, washed out sections, mudslides. It felt like the entire world was trying to keep me from getting out of there. I had no choice but to slow down again. The thought of that man kept creeping into my mind. Who was he? What the hell was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere, standing in the road like that? Then I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. Another figure stood in the road. I hit the brakes again, my heart hammering. This one was different, shorter, thinner. A woman, maybe. She stood with her arms at her sides, head down, completely motionless. I wasn't going to stop. I swerved slightly, intending to go around her, but as I did, she moved, quick, jerky, unnatural. My headlights barely caught the movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. She lunged at my truck. I floored it. I heard the sickening thud of something hitting my rear bumper as I sped past, my tires kicking up water and mud. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I didn't dare look in my mirrors. I drove for what felt like forever, gripping the wheel so tightly my hands ached. The road stretched on, endless and empty. I needed gas, needed to find a main road, needed to get the hell out of here. That's when my engine sputtered. No, not now. The gas light had been on for miles, but I had prayed I could make it just a little farther. But the truck had other plans. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. I rolled to a stop on the side of the road, the rain still coming down in sheets. I sat there in silence, listening to nothing but the sound of water hitting metal. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the empty road ahead. I reached for my phone again. Still no service. I was stranded. I had to think. I had passed a small dirt road a ways back. Maybe there was a house or cabin nearby. Maybe someone could help. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and took a deep breath before stepping out into the rain. The moment my boots hit the ground, I felt it. I wasn't alone. Somewhere beyond the trees, something moved. I didn't wait to find out what. I headed for the dirt road, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. My clothes were soaked in seconds, the cold biting through me. Every step felt heavier, like the mud was trying to pull me under. Then I saw it. A small cabin, tucked just beyond the tree line. A faint light glowed from inside. Relief flooded through me. I picked up my pace, nearly slipping in the mud as I made my way toward it. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The door was slightly open, swinging gently in the wind. The light inside flickered. I stopped at the edge of the porch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could see inside now, just a single room barely furnished. A table, a chair, a bed against the far wall. And then I saw him, the man from the road. He sat in the chair, facing the door, watching me. I took a step back. He didn't move. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the trees. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smile. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran. I didn't care about the truck anymore, didn't care about the road. I just needed to get away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found a main road. Headlights appeared in the distance, and I waved frantically until a passing car stopped. The driver took me to the nearest gas station, and I called for help. When the police went back to check the cabin, they found nothing. No man, no chair, no light. Just an empty, rotting building in the middle of nowhere. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stepped inside that cabin, I wouldn't have come back out. I've been driving trucks for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen just about everything: bad weather, worse roads, breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, and some of the strangest people you could ever imagine. But nothing comes close to what happened that night on Highway 41. It was late November, somewhere in the Midwest, one of those stretches of road where the nearest town is just a name on a map. I had picked up a load of farm equipment from a supplier in Wisconsin and was on my way south toward Missouri. The schedule was tight, and I was already behind thanks to a detour caused by an accident earlier in the day. The sun had dipped below the horizon an hour before, and the temperature was dropping fast. The radio was nothing but static. My cell signal had been gone for miles, and the road was empty. No other headlights ahead or behind me. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the endless blacktop cutting through the darkness. Around 10 p.m., I spotted something up ahead on the shoulder. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I saw it was a person. A man, standing just past the mile marker, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He wasn't waving me down, just standing there, staring at my truck as I approached. Something about him unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he stood, too stiff, too still. Or maybe it was just the fact that there was nothing out here, no towns, no houses, nothing for miles. I passed him without slowing down. Truckers know better than to pick up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere at night. I checked my mirrors as I went by, expecting to see him disappear into the distance. But he didn't move. He just stood there watching. I shook it off. Weird people are part of the job. But something about this guy made my skin crawl. 15 minutes later, I saw him again. Same dark jacket, same jeans, same stiff posture. He was standing on the shoulder, maybe 100 yards ahead. I know how ridiculous it sounds, but it was him. It had to be. Same build, same stance, same feeling of wrongness. My grip tightened on the wheel. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. No side roads, no cars, nothing. I would have seen him running or a vehicle picking him up. But he was there, waiting, watching. I kept driving. As I passed him a second time, my stomach twisted. I didn't look at him directly, just flicked my eyes to the side for a second. He was closer this time, standing almost on the white line. I couldn't see his face, just darkness under the hood of his jacket. And then he turned his head, just slightly, just enough. I don't scare easy, but something about that movement sent a jolt of fear through my chest like ice water. I pressed harder on the gas. I kept my eyes on the road, forcing myself to ignore whatever the hell had just happened. My rational brain was screaming that there had to be an explanation. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe there were 2 different guys who just happened to look alike. But I knew better. I checked my mirrors again. The road behind me was empty. I exhaled. Maybe it was over. Maybe, and then my headlights hit something ahead. The man, standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard. My tires screeched, my trailer rocked, and for a second, I thought I was going to jackknife. My truck groaned as I brought it to a stop, just a few feet from where he stood. I barely had time to process what I was seeing. He was closer now, close enough that I should have been able to see his face. But there was nothing, just a void under the hood. And then, slowly, he started walking toward me. I threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. I didn't care if he was real or not. I didn't care if I was hallucinating. I just needed to get away. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring as I swerved around him. My trailer wobbled dangerously as I pulled back into my lane. I didn't look back. I just drove. I don't know how long I kept my foot on the gas, but when I finally eased off, my hands were shaking. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The highway stretched out ahead, endless and empty. The darkness felt heavier now, pressing in from all sides. I kept expecting to see him again. Around every bend, over every hill, I braced myself for those dark clothes and that faceless head standing in my path. But he didn't appear. It was another 20 miles before I saw headlights in the distance. Another truck coming in the opposite direction. I flicked my high beams twice, the universal trucker signal for trouble ahead. The other driver didn't signal back. As we passed, I glanced at his cab. For a split second, I saw his face, and I knew he had seen it too. I kept driving. By the time I reached the next truck stop, I felt like I had been holding my breath for an hour. I pulled into the lot, parked, and shut the engine off. I sat there in the silence, hands still gripping the wheel. I never told anyone what happened that night, but I never drove that stretch of road again, and I never, ever stopped for anything on the highway after dark. I grew up in cities my whole life, so I never really knew what it was like to be alone in the countryside. The first time I ever got a real taste of it was in 2015 when I moved to a remote town in northern Montana. I wasn't there for anything exciting, just a simple job at a sawmill that needed extra hands. I was 34 at the time, and I figured I'd take whatever work I could get. I was used to busy streets, bright lights, and the constant hum of people. Moving to a town with barely a few hundred people, where the nearest gas station was a 30-minute drive, was like stepping into another world. The town itself wasn't much, just a collection of old houses, a single grocery store, and a diner that shut down before it got dark. It wasn't exactly welcoming either. The people weren't mean, but they kept to themselves. Most of them had lived there their whole lives, so they weren't really interested in getting to know an outsider. I rented a small cabin about 5 miles outside of town, deep in the woods, past a long stretch of dirt road that barely even looked like a road. It was cheap, isolated, and honestly, I kind of liked it. No noisy neighbors, no traffic, just endless trees and quiet. First, it was peaceful. I'd wake up early, drive to work, spend the day at the mill, and come home to a dark, silent cabin. I had no TV, no internet, and barely any cell service. My evenings were spent sitting on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. I thought I could get used to it. That was before the noises started. First, it was small things, twigs snapping in the distance, the sound of something moving through the brush just beyond the tree line. Normal forest sounds, I told myself, could be a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. But then it got worse. Some nights, I'd hear footsteps crunching through the gravel outside my cabin. Slow, deliberate, not like an animal. Animals don't move like that. They don't stop and start again like someone thinking about what they're doing. I'd sit there in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing ever did. The footsteps would come and go, fading back into the woods like they were never there. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed. One night, it was worse than ever. I had just laid down when I heard it again. The same slow, careful steps outside. But this time, they didn't stop at the tree line. They came closer, closer than ever before, right up to my front porch. I held my breath, waiting. The floorboards creaked. I gripped the flashlight so tight my knuckles went white. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. I just laid there, frozen, listening. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked outside and saw them. Footprints, clear as day, in the dirt just outside my door. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots. Someone had been standing there, right outside my cabin, watching. I told myself it had to be someone from town. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe some kid messing around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. No one from town ever came out this far. There was nothing out here. Nothing but me. After that, I started keeping my rifle close. A week passed. The footsteps came and went, always at night. Sometimes they stopped at my porch. Sometimes they circled the cabin. I never saw anyone, never heard a car, just the footsteps. Then one night something changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to come like it always did. But instead of footsteps, I heard something else. A faint tapping, slow, rhythmic, coming from the window. I turned my head, pulse hammering. There, just beyond the glass, was the outline of a figure. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, shining it straight at the window. Nothing, just an empty window. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my rifle, and yanked the door open. The night was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the trees stretching out into the dark. I shined the flashlight around, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then I saw them, fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away from the window. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of my cabin, rifle in my lap, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I made a decision. I was done. I packed my bags, loaded them into my truck, and drove straight into town. I went to the owner of the mill and quit on the spot. Then, I went straight to the landlord and told him I was leaving. I didn't even ask for my deposit back. By noon, I was on the road, leaving that place behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the city. I never went back, never even thought about it. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching me, and it wasn't an animal.